So Kathy is the principal and CEO of Tunheim, where she oversees strategic planning for clients and is actively involved in client service and counseling. Tunheim has grown to be one of Minnesota's largest independent communications consultancies. She has extensive experience in corporate, government, and nonprofit communications management, with particular expertise in assisting clients' needs in media relations, crisis management, and public policy. She's president emeritus of IPREX, IPREX, a worldwide enterprise of independent public relations firms in major markets. And I have a feeling she has a story as to why this topic is of interest to her. But we'll wait for her to tell us that. Please welcome Kathy Tunheim.
Thank you, Faith. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity and I appreciate the invitation very, very much. It is fun to have a chance to be back at Concordia. Jack and I were here last week. I call him Jack. Everybody else here calls him John. I'm sorry. John was here last week for homecoming. We're sorry about the football game, but it was great to see so many people. We had a particularly good time at the alumni dinner where our very good friend Murray Frang was one of the people honored. He's somebody that we've known for many, many, many years, and we're very proud to have a chance to be here with him. So thanks to the college for that recognition of Murray. They said, I appreciate a chance to be here, even if it is to talk about a topic that most of us, I don't think, want to talk about, difficult conversations. When Paul called me and asked if I would be willing to come up, and he suggested my topic, I thought, now I wonder why he's thinking I should be the one to come and talk about that. Have Paul Dovery and I had some difficult conversations? And maybe we have over the years. But it is true, as Faith said, that in my professional life, this is something that I do. I have opinions and insights on this topic, and I'll be happy to share some of them. But I also think it's one of those topics that perhaps you came into the room with some preconceived ideas about what I might talk about, and maybe even hoping that there were certain kinds of difficult conversations you would hope I would touch on because you've either got one coming or you've had one and you're still trying to figure out how it went. So if that's true, on your tables there are some little blue index cards. And I would ask you to jot down the kind of difficult conversation that you assumed we were going to talk about here today, or maybe one you'd like to make sure I touch on. Think of it as a free few minutes of counsel from somebody who does this for a living. I'm happy to do it, free of charge, or actually in exchange for this wonderful lunch, let's put it that way. So if there are particular kinds of conversations, I'd really love to hear what those are that you'd like to have me touch on. So write them up on that card and kind of flash like this, and Faith and I will make sure we get them grabbed and talk about them. Most simply, what I would say about sort of setting the table for this conversation is that my career has been focused on helping organizations and their leaders answer three fundamental questions. The first question is, who are you? What is your organization? Who are you as a leader? What are you about? What are your values? How clearly are you understood for who you are? The second area of questioning is, what is it you are trying to accomplish? What is your mission? What are you trying to, what do we need to measure? How will you know what success looks like? Right? These are all things that all organizations think about. My job is to force articulation and clarity about, first, who are you? Who is your organization? And the second is, what are you trying to accomplish? And the third is, who needs to care about who you are and what you're accomplishing for you to be successful? Our core belief as a consulting group is that in a free society, those who are best understood will be the most effective. Or said another way, we believe that well-informed people make good decisions. So when people, customers, your employees, your investors, make what seem to you to be dumb decisions, or decisions that aren't even in their own self-interest, it isn't really usually because they're dumb or masochistic. It's because they don't have the information or they haven't had an opportunity to focus on information that would help them make a better decision. So whether you're looking at consumers or customers of a company, voters in an election, it's our human tendency to assume the end consumer for a dumb decision. I can't believe they went with that other company. I can't believe that prospect took a different job. I can't believe who they voted for. But our contention in our business, based on a lot of years of experience in helping organizations think about being understood, is that if you want to, as Michael Jackson said in a song a long time ago, if you want to change the world, take a look at yourself in the mirror and change. Maybe you need to own responsibility for whether you're understood. If you want people to pick your company or your product or you need to make sure you're clear about who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. If they understand you and understand the mission that you're on, they're going to be with you to some extent. Whether they join with you whole hog and pick up your mission or not has a lot to do with other things in their lives. But they're not going to get in your way. Understanding is key to being successful. So why am I dwelling on this notion of being understood? Well, it's because I believe it's at the heart of difficult conversations. It's when we need to be understood or when we need to understand someone else that we really care about getting a conversation right. There are all kinds of conversations we can be anxious about, but the ones we really know are important are the ones where understanding has to occur. We have to be understood and they have to understand us. These are important conversations. There's some reasons why they're difficult, and I'm going to get into that in a few minutes, but I think the first thing is to understand that conversations are critical elements. Being good at conversations is a critical skill for being understood. And I believe being understood is essential to being successful. There's three concepts I'm going to keep coming back to, and none of them are going to be revolutionary. You'll have heard them all. The first is content. Words matter, right? The choices we make matter, both to be understood in the moment and for the legacy of that moment. If it was an important conversation, you should expect that the words you used are going to resonate over and over and over again with somebody. It's going to matter that you took the care to have the right words. So content matters. The message matters. The second thing that really matters is context, of course, right? The setting, the timing, the noise around you, the nonverbals that went with the messaging. We all know from our own experiences that context, they're like filters. It can completely change what happens in a conversation. And so being responsible about context in a conversation is really, really important if you want to be understood, as you intend to be understood. And the third thing that I think is important about important conversation, is having a goal of mutual comprehension. That is, I need to understand and you need to understand. That's the objective of a good conversation, right? That's the objective of a good conversation. So content matters. The words matter. Context matters because it changes our ability to hear. And mutual comprehension should be the objective. So given that set of criteria, let me just take one category of messaging pretty much off the table for this conversation about managing difficult conversations. Conversations are two-way experiences. This is important to acknowledge. So if what you're really thinking about when you think about a difficult conversation is in fact a one-way delivery of some bad news that you hope will just be accepted, that's not a conversation, and don't set yourself up for that to be a conversation, because it won't be. The recipient isn't thinking of it as a conversation. You're fired, or your job is being eliminated, or you are not going to get that promotion. That is the proclamation of a decision that's already been made. And let's be honest, you don't actually want a conversation. You just know you have an obligation to deliver some news. And I'll tell you from experience, you're not doing the recipient any favor by trying to turn it into a conversation. Because right after you say your job's being eliminated, everything is just white noise anyway. They're thinking about how I'm going to tell my spouse, how am I going to pay the mortgage, where am I going to go after this meeting. They can't hear anything you're saying, so don't make it into a conversation. If you have a need for an ongoing relationship with that person, so for example, if the message is you're not going to get that promotion you were counting on, but we need to continue to have a good working relationship, now you need each other. So you're going to want to offer a conversation, but not at that moment, because again, the white noise is there. They're not ready for a conversation. So don't set yourself up for one. When you're in a situation where you have to deliver a piece of news, deliver the piece of news, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Offer a conversation when it can be a fair two-way experience, right? The most difficult conversation, so I've set that aside. Delivery of bad news is not a conversation. It's a meeting where you accomplish what you need to, right? Conversations that are difficult, I think, are the ones that are about setting or resetting expectations between two people who need each other. They may not even want to need each other, but they need each other. So they're colleagues in work, they're colleagues in the church, family, congregation. It's even true in families, although the dynamics around families are a little different. We can get out into those if we want. But setting and resetting expectations is one of the hardest things for two humans to do. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. But so we'll use those as examples of tough conversations, difficult conversations. And there's a couple of reasons why they're difficult. One is human nature. It's our human nature to gravitate to people we already understand, that we like. If we like them and we know them, understanding their messaging is easier. We understand the words. We speak the same language. We understand each other. We all gravitate to those communications. We also gravitate to communication and engagement with people who agree with us. Context is a lot easier if you have the same values. You kind of already accept a lot of the same things as truth together. Those communications are easier when you know where somebody's coming from, when you speak the same language and so on. When you have the same history, context is easier. Comprehension, I should say, is easier. And so because of this aspect, when we have to have a conversation with somebody who we don't understand, or we don't agree with, or we don't understand where they're coming from, this gets a lot harder, right? The content is harder, the message, the word choices matter more. Understanding context and where they're coming from and what filters they might be thinking about. Those things all matter more. But it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, you need mutual comprehension. You need to understand them, and they need to understand you. But accepting that the conversations that you're anxious about that feel difficult might be because of this human nature. You don't understand them. You don't have the same history. You don't have the same context. Acknowledging that allows you to not take it out on them, which is what we tend to do. When we're anxious about a conversation, when we're nervous about a meeting, a conversation we need to have, we get all fired up and all prepared, say exactly what we want to say, but we're not really on good to receive. It's not really a two-way experience. We're venting. We're dumping, right? Because we're nervous. We don't understand where they're coming from. So again, just accepting that sometimes the conversations that we're really anxious about are because we maybe have to take some time and energy to understand who we're talking to, what their context is, what language is going to work with them, take responsibility for being understood yourself, number one. And number two, conversation's not over till you understand too. It's a two-way experience. You got to be understood, you got to understand. That's a good conversation, right? Another thing that makes it hard, in organizational life especially, although this is even true in families, but certainly true in organizational life, is that hierarchy and structure communicates too, and it makes clear communications more difficult. The best example, of course, is when in any organization, the senior-most people have an idea, and it gets communicated out, and it pretty universally gets talked about as a great idea. It may or may not be a great idea, but when it comes from the top, the inclination to speak out and say, dumb idea, or I don't understand this idea, or I don't think it's going to work, those things don't get verbalized in an organization where hierarchy speaks, where hierarchy is part of the conversation, right? And so if you're a senior person, finding a way to actually have conversations about your idea requires real intention. Finding ways to say, I want to talk about an idea, I want to talk about a situation, and getting people to actually have honest conversation with you. You have to accept the reality of hierarchy and structure and how it affects the way people think about things. And it works the other way. Sometimes what happens in an organization is that a decision gets distributed out with the message that we think this middle management person, for example, might say, I think this is kind of a dumb idea, but powers that be have already decided, so we're going to do it. Now think about what that does to honest conversation. Pretty much says, even if you don't think this is a good idea, don't bother telling me about it, because we've already decided. It's already happened. So again, examples just to make the point, having the intention of honest and good conversation takes work. It takes acknowledging these things about, do we understand each other well enough that you know what content to use? Have you thought about how to suggest context and how to take context into consideration? So, what are some ingredients to good communication, to good conversation, right? Well, the first thing I would say, let me say it this way, and I think we all know this in our own lives. Most effective communications is mostly about listening and less about talking. So when we think about a difficult conversation we're getting ready to have, restrain yourself from thinking about all the things you want to say. And instead, think about the things you want to ask. The objective is mutual comprehension at the end of a good conversation. You already know what you think. You understand what the other person is thinking about. You understand the context they're bringing to it, confusion they might be bringing to it, right? So striving in a conversation for equal parts, speaking and listening, seems really simple, but I would challenge you to think about your own difficult conversations and ask yourself how good you are at sharing the oxygen in an important conversation. So that's one. Equal parts, speaking and listening, makes for a great conversation, right? Another is that both parties in a conversation should have a chance to prepare. And again, I think human nature, we don't always do this, right? We get psyched up for a difficult conversation and we launch into it when we're ready. We're armed. We're all competitive people, so we jump into these things thinking a good conversation has a winner and a loser. It might, But the real measurement is mutual comprehension. And so you think in your own circumstances, none of us are great. Well, some of you are. People are really good when they get jumped, and they know how to handle themselves in a tough conversation. But most of us are better if we have a chance to prepare. I'm one of those people who always thinks the next day about what I wish I had said, or I wish I had thought of, a very clever retort, if only I had had a few minutes to get my head wrapped around it. So if somebody wants a good conversation with me, a chance to prepare is something I appreciate, and I think it's true for most of us. Another one that seems obvious, but it has to be said out loud, a great conversation, an important conversation, requires honest content. And not just from your perspective, but from both perspectives. The example I like to give, as I think about this, is that in organizational life, sometimes things don't go according to plan. Business has a downturn. Organizations have a challenge. And there's bad news that we have to deal with. It's really important, I think, if you're the person with power in a conversation, to acknowledge your part in the bad news. So when I've had to lay people off, and I've had to do it once in my career, I'll never do it again, I had to acknowledge the reason we were in this circumstance is that I hadn't done a good enough job as a manager to anticipate what was going to happen. And here I was in a situation where my only options were bad ones, and they affected other people more than they affected me. It was important for me to acknowledge the reason we're in this predicament is something I did. It's not something you did, or it might be a little bit what you did, but it's also about me. It's also my responsibility. So honest content, the circumstance we're in, or the reason we need to have this difficult conversation is because of a certain set of facts. As I said at the outset, content matters. If it's an important conversation you're having with somebody, you should assume the words you use are going to resonate with them over and over and over again. And your integrity, I believe, requires that as they reflect on that conversation, they understand the ethical nature of how you handled that conversation. Saying whatever you have to say to get out of a difficult conversation doesn't reflect well on you in that moment, and it doesn't reflect well on you or your organization down the road. So no shortcuts to mutual comprehension in a difficult conversation. It requires honesty, which isn't always easy, especially since if you're like me, you're a human, you make mistakes, and we have to own those, and those have to be a part of an honest conversation. This one, again, probably goes without saying, but it needs to be said out loud, I think. Mutual respect is essential for a great conversation. Don't have to agree about everything, but we have to be mutually respectful. You know, golden rule is still that, golden. Think about how you would like it to happen if somebody feels the need to challenge you, to tell you that you made a mistake, that you've underperformed. You want appropriate privacy. You want some space afterward to process it. You want physical security. You want to be in a place where you have to worry. And again, you want an opportunity to listen and to be listened to if it's really going to be a conversation, right? So for example, if we have to give a piece of bad news about performance, Kathy, I need to tell you, you've really let us down in your performance on Project X. Let's get together next Tuesday and talk about it. Don't unload on me in the moment. I'm not there, right? But if we want a real conversation about why my performance is so under par, let's do it when I've had a chance to think about it and be prepared for it. And then, again, come into that conversation, equal parts listening and talking. You got to ask the questions. If you really want comprehension, you really want mutual understanding. You can see as I'm talking about this why it really matters whether on the other side of an important, difficult conversation, there's a relationship. So I'd like to say, go back to the beginning. If one of the examples is you're fired or your job's being eliminated, it may be important to you, if you're the one delivering that message, that the person feel okay about you. And so you want to have a conversation, make sure they understand how much you didn't want to do this. But mutual comprehension, being understood, both sides. This person who got that news from you is fully informed. And they no longer have big self-interest in understanding you. They need to get on with their life. And it's important that you respect them enough to understand that. So you deliver the message, you ask them if they have questions, you ask them if they want to have an opportunity to talk sometime down the road when they've prepared for it, but it's up to them. It's a tough thing to parse through, but I think we often in our lives spend a lot of time worrying about the conversations that aren't the ones we need to worry about, as much as the ones we need to worry about, again, where it's about a relationship that must go on, but needs to have its expectations of each other set or reset so that the relationship can be mutually understood on the back side of that conversation. There's a lot of tough messages we have to deliver in our professional lives and in our personal lives, but they're different than a conversation. Another thing that's important is that no matter how brilliantly you think you handle a difficult conversation, you thought your words were perfect, your tone was exactly what you wanted, the person was nodding in acknowledgement of what you were saying. Never assume that communication, effective communication, really occurred, right? Because even if you've prepared somebody, which I advise, letting them know what the conversation's going to be about, letting them prepare. Those messages, we've all heard the fire hose in our face. When you're getting an important, difficult conversation taken care of, the opportunity for each of us to have an opportunity to process it on the backside, to think about what the person said, to make sure I have a chance to ask questions about it and so on, benefits from a little time and reflection. So following up on important, difficult conversations is important too, especially if there's a need for a relationship going forward. Again, as I said, if there's no need for a relationship going forward, you really need to let the other person decide whether there's reasons to keep talking. But if this is a collegial relationship, if it's somebody you have to work with, somebody who's in your congregation with you, if it's somebody that's in an organization that you both have leadership in, then finding a way to say, did we hear each other? Can we have a subsequent conversation? Can you send me a note about what you think that conversation was about? Finding ways to say, did we in fact reach mutual comprehension is an important thing to take responsibility for. Because if you don't do that, you're making some assumptions again, and we know how those usually turn out. Not so well. It's human nature to hear what we want to hear. It's also human nature to believe other people heard what we meant to say. Right? We miss each other a lot. And if the conversation that you're contemplating or having to think about is one that is with someone that you need for the success of your organization or the success of your other relationships, then you have an obligation to get mutual comprehension, mutual understanding, no matter how difficult the situation is, no matter how uncomfortable the situation is. I haven't talked yet about some things to consider, but consider carefully. Humor. Humor in a difficult situation, difficult conversation, very dangerous. If you're really good, go for it. But for the most part, if a difficult conversation is about careful messaging, and mutual comprehension at the end, you need to make sure you've got senses of humor that kind of work with each other too. And in my experience, that's hard to do. I think as the person coming into a difficult conversation, who's in control, you're in the power position, or you're the one with the information, or you're the one with the decision to make, you can think humor deflects some of the pressure, some of the tension. Walk a mile in the other person's shoes before you do it, and maybe you'll talk yourself into it, but I think for the most part you'll find it's not helpful to mutually respectful communication where you end up coming away saying we understood each other. We can respect each other, we can disagree. I don't have to agree with the decision you made, but I've had a chance to talk with you about it, and now I understand it and I can accept it. Sometimes that's all we can aspire to, is mutual understanding and acceptance, right? And for the most part, that's all we expect in organizational life. As human beings, we want more than that. We want collegiality, we want friendship, we want support from each other. But in organizational life, that isn't always achievable. It's great when it is. So difficult conversations. Does anybody have one or two they want to make sure we talk about? Any blue cards? I've been very serious. I'm hoping for a good example that somebody wants to talk about. Somebody must have had a difficult conversation they want to talk about. Anybody ever had a difficult conversation that they didn't feel the other side handled very well? I bet there's volunteers there. Yeah. Yep. Yep. People hear the question, what happens when the difficult conversation gets sprung on you? You're not the one initiating it. I still believe, even this is why I said hierarchy is a tricky thing, because it sends lots of signals about who gets to decide when we have a difficult conversation. But I'll still take the position that at the end of the day, even somebody who springs a tough conversation on somebody, they really want mutual understanding at the end. And so I think you have the obligation to say, I know this is an important conversation. I don't think I can have it now. I don't think I can have it now. And unless it's not a mutually respectful relationship, that will be accepted. It has to be accepted. If you want to have a conversation with me, I need an opportunity to be prepared for it. I can't do it right now. That's a legitimate answer to the question. And I think, again, if you're in a situation where that's not acceptable to the other party, you have to be asking yourself, does this have any hope of being a mutually respectful conversation? And if it doesn't, I'm now better informed, and I need to make decisions that are in my self-interest, which might be, I don't need this conversation. And I don't mean that to be flip at all. I think mutual respect in a relationship is essential for effective communication. Yeah.
I'd like to take the flip side of that question. If I want to have a conversation with someone, and I like the idea of giving them a chance to prepare, but a lot of times, if you know the individual is just going to kind of go ballistic, or, you know, is not gonna, they're gonna wanna know more information, they're going to
Right.
be pressuring you to have the conversation now, and you know it's gonna go badly if you just continue. I
Yeah.
can see saying, you know, you need to take some time and think about this. I don't know, I'd like some advice there,
Yeah.
what you would do.
You bet. Again, I think, ask yourself, what is the point of this exchange I'm getting ready to have? If this exchange is to deliver a decision that's already been made, make it short. You say, George, this is the decision. I know you're going to be disappointed, and I want to talk with you about it when you've had a chance to think about it. Let's get together next Thursday. Or right? Go ahead. Yep. Performance issue, right. So I think if it's a person who, if you know their personality and you know they're going to be combative, angry, whatever those things are, right? The objective is mutual comprehension. And so you got to take a couple steps back and say, how do I need to set up this conversation so that I can understand George and George has to understand me? And it might mean in a situation like that, some of the information gets provided first in writing. It might mean providing George with a set of questions to think about before the conversation. Whatever you have to do to break through, because again, the point here is not to have George be happy, not going to be happy. But if there's an ongoing requirement to have a relationship with that person, this is a person you're going to be working with, or is going to be in the same company, or is going to be in the same small town, we want to do everything we can to get at comprehension. And the fact that you might be able to comprehend a performance conversation one way doesn't let you off the hook from the fact that he needs to be provided a different kind of a conversation. I mean, said bluntly or said plainly, this is hard work. It's hard work to actually have an effective, difficult conversation and have people on both sides walk away feeling mutually respected and heard. Doesn't mean agreed with, but heard. And to the extent possible, understood, right? It's the reason that, again, I sound callous when I say it, but when the message you're delivering is you're being terminated or your job's not going to be here anymore, spending a lot of time trying to make the person feel better about it or understand the decision is really not helpful. They are now well informed that their future is separate from this organization that you've been a part of together, and you have to let them decide how to process that. Later, you can hope that you can have a personal connection, personal friendship again, but so from my, I don't mean to sound callous, but when the conversation you're having is an ending, they're not really that complicated. You need to be clear, and you need to be respectful. When the relationship has to go forward on the back side of a tough conversation, those are the ones that are a lot of work, and they're worth the effort. Because if you understand each other on the back side, don't have to agree, but if you understand each other, you can continue to work together respectfully. You can find a way to continue to work together. So it may seem like a lot of work. You'd rather just give them the information and make them, deal with it. But if you do that, you're going to be dealing with it too, because you have a colleague who doesn't really understand, hasn't really been able to process. And they're not going to process it the same way you do. They're going to process it the way they need to. And sometimes it's incumbent on us in a relationship to do some of that work and allow them to do it. So, I think in those situations, you have to set it up to leave room for some bluster, some anger, some, deal making. What if I do this? Can't we talk about this? Can't we talk about this? Right? One of my own experiences, and it happened very early in my career. I became a manager of a group of people. I was in my mid-20s. Most everybody who worked for me was older than I was and more experienced. And I inherited a fellow who really was just not performing very well, and he wasn't going to survive. And frankly, when they gave me the job and put him in my team, they all knew it. But so I had the job of working out a very tough situation. And I took the position that we needed to give him a lot of time. Many months went by, and we tried performance reviews. We tried all kinds of coaching. We tried a lot of things. And I will always remember he came into my office at a point down the road, and he said, "This is it, isn't it?" And I said, "It is, Dave. This is the day. And here are some services to help you figure out where you should be." But we've stayed, I wouldn't say friends, but professional colleagues for decades since, because it was respectful. We had to go through a process that was longer than most people in my company thought it should take. I believed it was the right way to happen. So a long answer to a short question, but yeah.
Not be listening as well as you could, because the tenor of the conversation needs to be able to shift based on the information you're gaining and
You bet.
understanding. And if you're rigid in the questions and you're kind of going down your list, you're not listening as
Yeah.
well as you could.
Right. Absolutely right. The beginning of your question was, don't you think you can over-prepare? And I think the answer is yes, if all you're preparing is what you're going to say. But are you preparing what questions you need to ask? Are you preparing what you don't understand about why this performance problem can't get fixed? I mean, if you really believe, just to come back to that example, if you really believe the person was qualified for the job they were given, but it's not working, is it incumbent on you to try to figure out, why is this not working? The person not understand the objectives of the job? Did somebody give them bad information about what the goals are? I mean, what happened here? If it turns out that the person isn't qualified, should never have gotten the job in the first place, honest content, now you got to be careful how you say this, right? But the fact of the matter is, if somebody's in a job that they're never going to be successful at, or in a relationship or have a responsibility on a committee that they're never going to be successful at executing, what should we do about that? Let it go on and on and on and on and on? No. Difficult conversation has to be had to get things back in alignment. And it might sometimes require somebody acknowledging, I think we put you in a position you shouldn't have been in. I regret that we put you in a situation where we were asking you to perform something that you've really never had the opportunity to be prepared for. So here's what we need to do about that. So I think it's preparing not only what you need to say and what you need the other person to understand, but what is it that you don't understand about this situation? This is your best opportunity to actually understand it. What on earth happened in this situation? How did we get so crosswise of common purpose, right? But it's a great question. And I think, again, it's human nature. We spend a lot of time thinking exactly what we're going to say. Yeah.
So we have a lot of lawyers and even a couple federal judges.
Yeah, right.
One that, in the room.
Right. And I've had difficult conversations with him, let me just
I
tell
bet
you.
you have.
We won't say who won the argument, but yeah.
No one wants to know. No. So you're giving us some excellent advice about how to deal with difficult
Thank you.
conversations, and you've spoken pretty specifically about termination conversations, which aren't really conversations.
Right.
I haven't heard you say anything about calling your lawyer ahead of time, because
Yeah.
it seems like that's almost something you have to do these days.
Yes.
So how do you follow the advice on that? Because that's going to change what you say to them. Once you call the lawyer, they're going to start telling you what to say.
Yeah, right. This may or may not surprise you, since Jack and I have been married for 35 years. I actually don't disagree with lawyers very often. What I think is important is to not expect them to be very effective at communicating. No offense to the lawyers in the room. They're very good at understanding what the rules are and what the boundaries are, and helping us stay within those boundaries. But specific to your question, I think if you know, if the conversation that you're anxious about is a termination or eliminating somebody's job, as I said before, the communication is pretty brief and short and sweet. White noise after you've said the sentence. And so what they actually benefit from at that point is the packet of information that the lawyers helped you put together. They're going to consume that on their own time. They're going to have a chance to share it and get answers to their questions, and then maybe come back with more questions for you. But I actually think they work in tandem. I think, so let's take a more complicated example. If the difficult conversation is a performance discussion, it's somebody that, again, you have a responsibility and a need to continue to have a relationship on the other side of this tough conversation, there I think maybe the lawyers and I have some more attention once in a while, because I do think you have to be able to talk about what the current state of the performance is, or the expectations, and what's not working, and what are your obligations or your willingness to do a fix and let somebody try to get back on track and perform. In a true performance situation, I would be inclined to be partnering with my lawyers, though, to say, let's talk about the performance improvement program and be really clear. So far, you're not performing, and I want to make sure it's not because you don't understand, so this is where we get to have a conversation about, and I need to understand what's going wrong with you. But on a going forward basis, I need you to understand, here's what has to change in your performance, or here's the consequence if it doesn't get better. And that needs to be pretty prescriptive, pretty prescriptive. Otherwise, again, as human beings, we hear what we want to hear. And you come out of it saying, well, I'm not doing very well, but my boss is giving me another chance, and, I just got to buckle down and, do hard. No, it's more specific than that, right? There have to be some real clear expectations of each other. As I said at the outset, to me, the hardest conversations are about resetting expectations, because people hear what they want to hear about opportunity going forward, and it's really important that at the end of those conversations, there's as much agreement as possible about what success looks like for each person in that exchange. But for the most part, I think lawyers help us be explicit and specific in a way that in human conversation we're not inclined to be, because we're empathetic and we want people to think they still have a chance, right? I mean, we want to inspire them to try, make this relationship work, whatever it is. But if in fact, from an organizational perspective or an accountability perspective, there is a line that demarcates winning and losing, or continuing and not continuing, the more clearly somebody walks out of a conversation and understands that, the better their chance to step up and perform at that level. Gray is not helpful. Gray area not helpful in that kind of situation, I think. I'm sounding so grim. All these, but the truth of it is, I mean, isn't it funny? Are there difficult conversations that don't have to do with grim subjects? Not so much, right? I mean, sometimes it's things like a difficult conversation about caring for our parents. I happen to be at a point in my life, I bet others are too, where my siblings and I have to have some difficult conversations about choices for our parents going forward. And it's hard, right? It's hard because you come into it and you really don't even want to deal with the reality of it. If they're getting old, it means, that's one part of it, so we're in denial about that. People that we have for our entire lives thought of as some of the most vital, capable people we know are not so much anymore. You want to be in denial about that kind of conversation. And now we have to start making some choices for them. And in my case, I have 4 siblings. Thank goodness we really get along. We're unconditionally supportive of each other. But we haven't had to make some of the really hard choices yet. And I fully expect when we do, I'm going to be taking my own advice, preparing in advance, saying what are the things we need to talk about, making sure we understand each other. If we're going to make this decision about our mother, do we understand the consequence of that? For who has to be where and who has to do what and how are we going to pay for those things? I think the rules apply for all kinds of difficult conversations. I guess it goes in with the title that you gave me, Paul. Difficult conversations are never about really fun stuff. I don't think. If somebody can think of one, I'd love to hear it. But I think the rules still apply, whether it's a job situation or a tough sort of life choice situation that we face. They're conversations. That's the most important thing to remember. They're two-way. And a successful one has mutual comprehension at the end for both parties. And it doesn't come without hard work. It doesn't come without hard work. Other examples, yeah. Yep. So talk more about what trust means in a difficult conversation. It's a great point. I think it's one of the things that as you set the table for a difficult conversation, let's assume again, it's one where you're on the initiating end, and we'll take it from the other side in a second. But when you're on the initiating end, I think you have to, honest content is one of the things I talked about. You have to have an honest assessment of where is this conversation starting in terms of trust. Because if there's a high level of knowledge and trust about each other, then I think it goes back to something I said at the outset. If it's somebody you already know and you understand, and there's a high level of trust, the messaging comes pretty naturally. You speak the same language. You understand each other. You know each other's filters a little bit. And so the messaging is maybe a little bit easier. I think you can make assumptions about that are dangerous. If you're on the other side of this conversation and you're feeling a little jumped by a difficult conversation, your first instinct is to have your sense of trust disrupted, right? How could this be happening? Why is this person doing this to me? And I think mutual respect, preparation if possible, again, these same sort of notions are all in some ways intended to make sure, to the extent there's a trust relationship already, you're not breaching it in order to deal with a difficult subject. But I think it's a really, really important point to make, because if you are, again, if you're on the receiving end of an invitation to a difficult conversation, I think our visceral instinct is to question whether we can trust that person. Why would he or she jump me with this difficult conversation if we have a trust relationship? Tell me this. Tell me we need to talk about it. Tell me my performance. I mean, you're surprising me. And I know we can think to ourselves, how could this person not understand that they are not carrying their water? Accept it. People see what they want to see in dynamics sometimes, right? And so being mutually respectful, having the context for a conversation be such that it allows, if possible, to have the conversation based on whatever level of historic trust there was. Don't assume it, but I think plan for it. Try to have it on your side, if I can put it that way, and have it be a part of what you've got going for you to have a difficult conversation. Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like I've given everybody a really serious thing to ponder for their afternoon. What a way to spend a Friday, thinking about it. Yeah.
I'm in manufacturing, and we had obviously a bit of a downturn in the
Yep.
economy, and I found myself in a position where I had to let about 50 people go within the space of a couple months.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
so I've been listening to you, and I'm trying to wonder why I had some of those difficult conversations when perhaps I should have made it short and sweet,
Yep.
and wondering if I did that just to kind of make myself feel better, and you know, I think, and some of those people didn't want to have a conversation. It was clear,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's fine. But I felt that I needed to explain what was happening to the best of my ability
Yep.
to them, and a lot of them did want to have a conversation
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And you know, the message at the time was, I don't know if this is going to come back, and I would just recommend that you go look for work elsewhere.
Right. Yep. Oh, I think,
And now things are coming back, and people hear that we're hiring again, and I'm seeing a lot of those faces come back.
that's great.
And I think if I didn't try and have that conversation with them at that time, they wouldn't be trying to come back,
Mhm.
because they didn't understand what was happening.
Yep.
Because I didn't take the time to explain to them.
Yep, and I completely accept what you're saying, and I certainly don't want to I don't want to be understood to say it's never worth it, but I think if in your judgment, those were conversations where there was an opportunity for them to understand, then you're making the right decision to invest the time and do that. I guess part of my message is, don't be surprised when some of them end up saying, I don't need this conversation, I don't want this conversation, because they're making the right decision for them, they think, at that point. I will say, too, not knowing more about the specific circumstances of your company's situation, you remind me, as I was preparing for today, I was remembering early in my career, I was responsible for all the communications for Honeywell Corporations, based in Minneapolis for a long time. And I had been for some years responsible for all the external communications of the company, to customers, investors, and so on. And then at a point in my career, I was asked to also take on responsibility for employee communications, all the internal communications. And I brought in a consultant and had them help me figure out whether we had good tools for keeping people informed and so on, and what should we do about internal communications. And I always remember the consultant came back and said, well, Kathy, first of all, there aren't very many tools. The company doesn't seem to have invested very much in keeping people informed about what's going on. He said, I've done some focus groups, and the most concerning thing is that the employees seem surprised by the fact that the company needs to change. The company was in a lot of trouble financially. All you had to do was read the paper to realize the company was in a lot of trouble. But we hadn't done a very good job of helping our employees understand the environment around us and what was happening to us. So if you were able to be successful in conversations with your employees, my suspicion is your company was doing a somewhat better job than early in my career I had an experience with in understanding that the company was under pressure. It still doesn't take away the sting when you're the person who loses a job, but it does help. It does help to have the context that it isn't about them, it's about the industry that you're in or the performance of the economy and so on. So, because again, at the end of the day, what an individual in a conversation is trying to grasp is comprehension. Who am I? What am I trying to do? And what has happened to me here? What is happening to me? And if what's happening to them is something that they have to take responsibility for, then they need to do that. If what they have to if what they have to accept is that they're a victim of something that happened to somebody else, they didn't do anything wrong. That's a different thing as a human being to process, right? But I commend you for taking the time and energy to do it, and my guess is it did make a big difference. Yeah. Sure. his question was, is it ever feasible to bring a whole group of people in and sort of deliver news? My own personal opinion is never to deliver the ultimate decision about somebody's employment. I think that requires the mutual respect requires you to have that a one-on-one. But I think, sort of building on the last comment, taking the responsibility to keep bringing people together and letting them understand contextually what's happening to our business. Here's what's happening in the economy. Here's what's happening to our company. Here's the pressure we're under. If you can't even, here are the choices we're facing. All those things help us as individuals start to think about, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for me? And if at a certain point you come to the realization that I might be at risk here, then at least when and if that news comes, it isn't really a surprise. It's disappointing, but it's not really a surprise. And in terms of mutually respectful conversation, that's what you want to go. You want understanding. As I said, you don't always get agreement, but you want understanding, comprehension of why something happened, why communication was what it was. Last words. Otherwise, yeah.
Sometimes people who are leaders in government or in business or the church or sometimes in education find themselves needing to have difficult conversations in public.
Yep.
And sometimes in public means that the media are present.
Right.
I was at a meeting at M State here a while ago when Governor Dayton had an open meeting about his proposed budget, and all the eyewitness news people were there with their cameras, and the press, the rest of the press was there,
Right.
and he was for 90 minutes, never knew from one moment
Right.
to the next
What the question was.
what the question was.
Right.
And so how do the dynamics change, or do they change?
Yeah.
When one is in a public setting,
Sure.
having a difficult conversation, often about something that the person who is speaking is impassioned about.
Absolutely.
That makes a great deal of difference to her or to him.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's hard to not hear that question and think about what we've all just gone through, watching what's happening in Washington, D.C. So whether you're talking about St. Paul or Washington, D.C., and this might surprise you, but I guess my own, and I should disclose, I began my career working for a governor. I do some work for our current governor in Minnesota. I've spent some time in Washington, D.C. With the U.S. Senate. So I'm a student of that question. So it may surprise you that fundamentally, the management issue is the same. The challenge in being in public is that the layers, think again, context and noise, the layers and the filters through which you have to communicate to be understood are massive and very, very challenging. But at the end of the day, the objective is the same, to be understood. And it's really hard work to be understood in the public square, especially again, and again, I will use our Washington situation. We all know that underneath what all has been happening is that there are some fundamentally different beliefs about how government should work, how money should be spent. And each of those fundamental beliefs are legitimate and authentic and have integrity. They are fundamentally in conflict with each other in certain ways. And so we're never going to get consensus about some aspects of that. What's deteriorated is in our civil society, our ability to say once in a while, you agree to what the House just had to agree to. They had to agree that they lost a round of the fight. They're not changing their fundamental beliefs, but they needed to accept that in our civil system, when you lose a round, you have to move on to the next round. And it's worked relatively well for 250 years, and I think it will continue to. Doesn't mean it's easy. But being understood with all of those filters and all that white noise in the context is very, very, very difficult. But it's fundamentally the same problem. It's fundamentally the same challenge. Who are you? What are you trying to accomplish? Who needs to care for you to be successful? That's how you need to focus your communications. And use every tool at your disposal. We've kind of focused here on an intimate conversations, but the issues are the same. If you're leading an organization, you have to use one-on-one conversation. You have to use one-way tools. You have to use media. You have to use intermediaries and others who help share your message. So it's a more complicated communications challenge, but the fundamentals are the same. Know who you are, know who you're trying to talk to, and know what it is they need to understand. Right. Thank you. Thanks very much. I enjoyed the chance to be here. I hope you have a funner afternoon than I may have set you off on. Thank you.
I guess this was a conversation whose time had come. Thank you so much for your very engaged participation this afternoon. And if we don't have your email address in our mailing list, please use one of the cards on the table to give us your information so we can communicate with you. Thank you very much.
Great.
See you next month.
Thank you, Kate.